Welcome to Chatter. I'm David Priess. This week, historian Rachel Shelden on 1876, election security and national security.
We take for granted, I think, that we have stayed together as a nation for as long as we have. Certainly people in the 19th century did not take that for granted. They thought about it all the time. We assume that everybody shares the same constitutional ideas throughout history, but there are so many constitutional problems in the 19th century that people are constantly trying to work out. And this is a moment where there is no guide, there is no clear way to handle it, and so they come up with this plan. There's one place in South Carolina that reports 101% voter turnout.
That's remarkable turnout.
People sometimes say that there is voter fraud in the U.S. today. We do not have voter fraud. This was real voter fraud.
Rachel Shelden, thanks for joining me on Chatter.
Thanks for having me.
I'm embarrassed that when we've talked before, I've failed to ask you some crucial questions about your background and how you got to where you are. So I do want to start with that before we get to this amazing, crazy, momentous election of 1876 and what went into 1877 that only seems to reach public attention when there's a disputed election. We've had a lot of those lately. But before we do that, I don't think I know the path you took to becoming a historian and focusing on the 19th century U.S. in the first place.
Yeah, so I grew up in Chicago, where you're sort of basically forced to become a Lincoln enthusiast,
The land of
which
Lincoln.
I was at an early age.
Yeah.
I had some really wonderful history teachers as a kid, including in high school. I was very lucky to be able to take African American history in high school, which I think is something that people are not usually exposed to. And I had a wonderful teacher, Charles Branham, who gave me just an incredible inspiration in history. And I studied history in college. And I spent a couple of years working at the Library of Congress after college, where I was able to really get into the documents, which I think further convinced me that I wanted to be a historian. I am 100% an archives rat. I love to spend time with the archives. And that was sort of my first real taste of what it's like to spend all your days in the archives.
Early on, when you were doing that archival research, was it in the first few hours, the first few days, or did it take longer for you to find the gem, right? The thing that you've been going through paper after paper, and you're kind of starting to get drowsy and thinking, how am I going to get through all this when I only have this much time? But then you find something that's truly remarkable that you didn't even know in many cases was there. Did you have that moment early?
It's a good question. So when I was working at the Library of Congress, I worked for a historian named Bob Remini, who was working on a book about the House of Representatives. And so I was reading all kinds of congressional papers, so congressmen's papers. And that is how I got interested in congressmen and sort of their lives. And I was supposed to be looking for sort of standard operating things about Congress, and quickly started noticing some of their personal foibles. So I think for me, it hit early because I kept seeing things that interested me. And they were things I was not supposed to be doing. But, you know, I spend so much time in the archives that I often find myself not finding things for days and days and weeks. But it's just the experience of being with the papers that I love. So it can be a drag, but it also is inspiring in that way.
Let me go back to something else you mentioned. You know, growing up in the land of Lincoln, which we both share. Tell me if you also had the searingly painful moment early on when, you know, you see it on the state seal, you see it on official state paperwork. It's Lincoln, Lincoln, Lincoln. And downstate, all the locations where Lincoln Douglas debates took place, make a deal out of it. And of course, there's New Salem and Springfield and everything. And I don't know what age I was, but here I was thinking land of Lincoln, Lincoln, Illinois, Lincoln representative, Lincoln elected from Illinois. And then somebody told me that he was actually born in Kentucky and grew up in Indiana. And I felt like the carpet had been pulled out from under me, that I'd been lied to about this. Now, I understand the formative period in Illinois and his history, but still, do you remember that it felt like we were sold a false bill of goods when we were, 5 years old?
I sort of suppose that I didn't care so much that we still got to claim him. And one thing about learning African American history so early in my life is that I got to learn about sort of the dark side of Lincoln in addition to his grandeur. I always think of Lincoln as a complicated figure, and I got to learn that at an early age, which I think a lot of students do not. Whenever I teach the Civil War era, or I teach classes on Lincoln sometimes, constitutional history, I find that students are like shocked to hear some of the things that Lincoln supported, or that he wasn't 100% anti-slavery in his early years.
Right.
So I got to see sort of that complicated background, and I think that lessened some of that shock for me maybe at an early age, because I found him more interesting, more human that way. Yeah.
The more I read about him, I feel the same. Is he's more compelling and more interesting because he's so imperfect and so challenging in many ways. But I also feel, if I were a historian, that as drawn as I am to Lincoln, I can't learn enough, because I always find something new every time I go deeper into a source. It feels like there's a glut there, that I've heard there was many books written about Abraham Lincoln as, Jesus. And I'm thinking, wow, you've got to find a really fine niche to add something to Lincoln scholarship at this point.
It's true. This is sort of the general field that I work in. I spent a lot of time thinking about the coming of the Civil War, constitutional history in the Civil War era, thinking about sort of the Civil War generally is a period that everybody and their brother has written about, political history in this period. But the fun thing about it is that there's always something to find. So in my first book, I wrote about politicians in Washington in the 1840s and 50s. And one of the sort of longstanding yarns about Lincoln is that he delivered this amazing speech in the House of Representatives called the Spot Resolutions about the U.S.-Mexico border. And I really discovered that nobody really cared about the spot resolutions. Most people were not listening to Lincoln. He was a young congressman. Most people did not pay attention to young congressmen. So Lincoln's reputation as this great congressman and having a great congressional career, I think, was wildly overblown. So I think you can always find something new to say if you find a broader context. We will still find new things to say about Lincoln, I think, even in 100 years.
Absolutely. Well,
Yeah.
I will recommend to readers your first book. It's a wonderful pairing with Joanne Freeman's book, who's also been on this podcast because of the really 1830s, 1840s, 50s experience with violence on Capitol Hill. I think the two really complement each other in important ways. We could talk about the Civil War and Abraham Lincoln for not just an hour and a half, 2 hours, but a year and a half, 2 years. But the reason I wanted to chat with you today is because we had another remarkable election. It did not, as of the time we're recording this, it did not lead to widespread political violence or even major instances of political violence or institutionally crippling disputes. But it very easily could have. And all the elements were in place for it. You had, extreme partisanship in divided government. You had questions about voter suppression or voter validity. You had legal challenges poised, all of this. And that has happened before, 2020, 2016 to some degree, certainly the year 2000, which means most of our recent elections for the president in the last few decades have had some kind of major dispute in ways that I just don't remember having as much when I was young and growing up. So I thought it would be really good to reflect on the 1876-77 experience And you've studied this intensely, written for it publicly. I know at least one chapter in your next book is going to really focus on this and understand the political culture around the times so that we can learn some lessons from it and understand what went well, what didn't go well for our ability to maintain the political institutions that we do have. So with that as preamble, that's what I'd like to focus on the most. I don't think we need to go through the Civil War and Reconstruction itself, but it's probably worth it to set the stage just a little bit about during the Grant administration, 1873 to 1877, what was happening in his second term in particular that was changing the political dynamic a bit in terms of Reconstruction, in terms of the South former Confederate voters versus black voters, especially in the South. Talk through that a little bit, what the situation was going into the presidential campaign and election of 1876.
Yeah, so there are a lot of important dynamics, and some of them have to do with Reconstruction in the former Confederate states, and some of them don't. So some that do have to do with the former Confederate states are that 8 of the 11 former Confederate states by 1876 had been what people had called, quote, redeemed, unquote, which means that white Democrats had retaken control of state governments and so had been wielding political power for some time. The Grant administration had withdrawn a lot of federal troops from these areas. The only states that had not had control of Democrats retaken in their states were Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida, all states that are going to play a really important role in the 1876 election. So sometimes we think of the 1876 election as causing the end of Reconstruction, but important to realize that's not the case because there were actually many states that had already moved into this period beyond Reconstruction. So that's what's going on in the South. There are still federal troops there in some places, but not everywhere. And most of these states had already moved into Democratic control.
And let me ask one follow-up there. There were still federal troops in several places.
Yes.
But my casual reading of the Times is that the attitude, especially in the North, towards those troops being there was dramatically different than it had been in, earlier in the decade.
Yes. So in the North, there had become more interest in some other issues, in part because in 1873, there had been a terrible financial panic. And so people were really upset about their own financial well-being. This had become a much bigger focus among many Northerners. And so they had started to move away from questions of Reconstruction. And Democrats had had a rise in their political power in the North. You'd also seen the rise of a new political party in 1872 called the Liberal Republicans, who had capitalized on a lot of major issues with the Grant administration. So one of them is civil service reform. Civil service reform is in large part because the Grant administration went through a whole series of really problematic, really awful corruption scandals. And so there's a big emphasis on trying to make government more responsible, more focused on professionalization as opposed to full of political appointments. So civil service reform is one of their issues. Another issue is trying to cut down on government costs. A third issue is trying to resume specie payments through gold. So paper money had been everywhere in the Civil War, and this was a really big thing that people had been using to make sure that they were going to be able to pay for things, and particularly Easterners wanted to resume payments in gold, and so the liberal Republicans were taking advantage of this. And so the liberal Republicans also added the end of Reconstruction to their list. And they did quite well in the 1872 election. And in fact, Democrats did not largely support a Democratic candidate in 1872. They mostly backed the liberal Republican candidate. There was a Democratic candidate, but mostly the liberal Republican candidate, Horace Greeley, got their votes.
And I'd like to put down a marker here if I understand from our previous conversations correctly. It's important for us. We're using terms that sound contemporary, like
Yes.
Republicans and
Yes.
Democrats. And if I understand it correctly, and please correct me here, that we can't simply put our current frame of mind and project it onto them because it wasn't the Republican Party then, isn't the Republican Party now. The Democratic Party is not the Democratic Party now. The names have changed, and you can try to trace a lineage, but it distorts more than it reveals. Does that sound about right?
That's correct. And really politics in general was just very different in this
Talk through
period.
that.
And
Like,
partisan
talk through how that played out.
Yeah. So today, right, we have a system that is very top down in our politics. So we think about politics as being controlled by national parties that have national nominating conventions that also feed into state and local parties. But politics in the 19th century through the 1870s and 1880s was really bottom up and really decentralized in such a way that you had a lot of parties operating on the state and local level that had nothing to do with national organizations. And you had lots of parties. And one of the reasons for this is that we did not have nationally organized or even state organized ballots. The Australian ballot, which is the thing that we use to vote with today, did not exist in the United States until the 1880s. Instead, people would vote by bringing a ticket to the polling place and putting it in a jar or giving it to the person who was collecting ballots. And usually what they did is they cut it out of the newspaper. It was printed in a newspaper, and you cut it out of the newspaper and brought it to the polling place. So in general, when we think about parties, we think about a two-party system that is stable and top-down. And that's just not the way that people operated in the 19th century. And as a result, you get so many different parties with the same name or variations on the same name because people wanted to claim that they were Republican, small r Republican, or Democratic, small d Democratic. And so they just repeated the same names. And that's why you have liberal Republican and also Republican, and why you have Democratic, but you also have Jeffersonian Democrats and Jacksonian Democrats and all these other kinds of parties over the 19th century. So we really do have to think differently about these parties.
Can you also share a little bit, related to that, share a little bit about the culture around presidential politics? Because now it is almost unimaginable that candidates aren't out campaigning, if not every day, certainly close to it. And that really wasn't the case, particularly early in the 19th century. But what was it like by the 1870s? Were candidates expected to be out shaking hands, kissing babies, going on tours around the United States? Were they expected to speak on their own behalf or use surrogates? What was the political culture around the presidential elections themselves?
Yeah, it's a great question. They really weren't. I mean, it was sort of frowned upon in general. Occasionally, candidates would go and meet with high-level political operatives, or they would give a speech in front of, say, a union club, or they would give a speech in front of some other prominent folks. But in general, they had surrogates who were going to go out and campaign for them. And in general, they used newspapers to make the case for them. So our newspapers were very partisan, purposely partisan, and would run their newspaper with a title that said, "We are the newspaper for Rutherford B. Hayes." That's what the newspaper would say. And they would create new newspapers for presidential candidates. In general, you were expected to be thrust into the presidency, not to want the presidency, which is part of why you would get presidential candidates from all over the political spectrum, including Supreme Court justices who were expected to be potential presidential candidates. And we had many of those over the course of the 19th century, people who were very competitive, including in 1876, 1872, and beyond.
That's amazing because now the thought of, and this will be a separate conversation, of course, we would have because you're focusing so much on it now, but the attitudes towards the judiciary and elective office or politics more widely is so different. I mean, in our context, I think it's beyond most Americans' lifetime at this point. What is it? Earl Warren, who was a Supreme Court justice and was on a presidential ticket in what, 48, 52, somewhere in there.
Justice Black. I think there were others who were sort of
Yeah.
interested in the mid 20th century, but
Yeah.
in
But
the
that's a
19th
while
century,
ago now, right? And
it was constant,
yeah.
and people were always interested in thinking about justices as compromise candidates who could rise above. But it wasn't just them. Everybody who was a potential presidential candidate was someone that others had to rally around as the person who would be a good possibility. So when we think about conventions, especially, the idea that a presidential candidate would speak at a convention was totally insane to these folks. It was not a possibility. And conventions were totally up in the air. Nobody knew who was going to be the candidate at the convention, and the convention ended up going all kinds of different directions, depending upon which year you were in. It was unlikely that you would get the person you expected.
Yeah. So here we are. It's the Grant administration. He had obviously run for a second term and won. There was a lot of speculation about running for a third term, and then of course later on he comes back. But he's kind of epiphenomenal for our main story. How did it line up that it ended up being Samuel Tilden, somewhat of a reformer in some ways, also someone who knew how to get messages out to public opinion, invented a lot of the things or mastered a lot of the things we take for granted now in terms of mailings and other ways of communicating. And then Rutherford B. Hayes, who wasn't really considered that prominent several years earlier, and suddenly he's the nominee instead of a James Blaine or other person in the Republican Party. How did that come to be? And then how were things looking as Election Day approached between the two candidates?
Yeah, so Tilden is a great story because he's governor of New York, and he is one of these guys who gets a great reputation by taking down the Tweed Ring. He's very involved in taking down corruption. So as I mentioned, corruption was a huge question in the 1876 election, had been for the past several years, and people were very concerned about the possibility of corruption. And so this really helped make his name. He'd been very successful in New York. He had deep connections in New York politics, and this allowed him to really make a name for himself. And so he's going to be able to win the nomination fairly easily. Importantly, because of the issues of specie payments, both parties were really divided. So they were divided regionally. We often think about the Civil War era as being a period where people are divided north and south, but it was also a period in which people were divided east and west. And Westerners tended to be much more in favor of paper money, and people in the east tended to be much more in favor of gold specie payments. And so as a result, you have this division between East and West. And so this is why he ends up with a Westerner as his running mate. We we don't think about the West as Indiana, but in fact, that was the West in the 19th century. People considered anything Ohio and further to be the West. And so this is why there's balance on his ticket, and you'll get the same in the Republican Party. You have Rutherford B. Hayes, who's the Ohio governor, really well connected among sort of elites in the Republican Party, and he is going to be joined by an Easterner from New York, William Wheeler, in the Republican Party. So really what happens is that they find this balance. James G. Blaine, who was one of the frontrunners for the Republican Party, had sort of made a lot of enemies in the Republican Party. And this is sort of the story of a lot of Republican politics in the 19th century, quite famously in 1860, when Lincoln wins his nomination, William Seward had been the front runner for that nomination, and doesn't really get that close to winning because he's made so many enemies in the Republican Party. So conventions are really seriously contested, and almost anything can happen depending upon where and how and sort of the mechanisms of the convention. So both of them are well enough known nationally to be able to run a reasonable campaign, and they're well organized. But it's going to be hard fought either way. Tilden is better known than Hayes, but they're I think relatively even going into the campaign, and they're split in similar ways. And so it's going to be quite challenging for either of them to win the election. The country is very divided. This is something that is very relevant to our sort of modern moment.
Sure.
It was going to be a highly contested election.
Yeah. And in part because the demographics had changed somewhat, not only in America with some immigration, which is a continuing story throughout the century, but with the voting population of 1876 versus 1872. You had more redeemed Confederate states, so you had a lot of white Southerners, many, if not most, former Confederates who were still thinking in a certain way. But then you also had a lot of Black Americans voting, in many cases for the first time. So you had new dynamics. You had the issue of Reconstruction. You had the issue of specie. You had a whole lot of variables going on, and I can only imagine we didn't have political scientists in the same way that we do now studying elections. But if we did, this would have been one of those where you would have predictions all over the place because that mix of variables was so unusual.
There's another issue that I haven't mentioned that was very big in the election, which is the question of funding for Catholic schools and fear of Catholics. I mean, this had become a major issue in the 1870s. It was a big issue in the 1850s. Again, those parallels to the 1850s are very serious. I mean, we sometimes talk about the current political moment as echoing the pre-Civil War period. I always have concerns about making those kinds of comparisons because the 19th century is just a different world. But people at that time saw a lot of comparison with the 1850s because of this sort of continued concern about the Catholic presence in the United States, and the idea that that taxes would support teaching Catholic students in Catholic schools. And this had become a major issue, especially in Republican politics. And so this is something that the Hayes campaign was really trying to capitalize in their campaign, somewhat successfully, I think, in the period before the election.
Now, in the 1850s, theoretically starting in the 1840s, but through the 1850s, you did have the Know Nothing Party. That was, some of the things you've mentioned. That didn't exist in the 1870s. Where were the voters generally leaning Democrat, Republican by the mid to late 1870s who were so significant in the 1850s in that Know Nothing movement?
Some of those are in other smaller parties, state-level parties, because that's always the case in the 19th century, is that people deal with those on the state level. That was true of the Know Nothings in the 1840s and 50s until they organized a national group. But they're not with the Democrats. That's the main thing. So there's some capitalizing of that among some groups of liberal Republicans, some labor groups, but not all, and then especially the Republicans who tried to capitalize it in the 1876 election. So, I mean, it's a real, this is the one thing that they think that they can make a difference between them and the Democrats, since both parties are split in many of these ways about financial issues, and the Republicans are not running as much on defending Black rights in the South as they had been in the past. So one of the problems with the 19th century political atmosphere is if you can't distinguish yourself from the other party, the other national party, or the other two or three national parties, you're not going to get great turnout. So you need to find some issue that is going to distinguish yourself. And in this case, this was one effective way in some places to do it.
You already mentioned Louisiana, South Carolina, Florida. So I'll use that as the thread to move forward here. Talk about election day, or more appropriately, like election night in 1876 and the days thereafter, and what happened in terms of the state votes that led to what was known and what was assumed about the electoral vote, and how that became such an issue of contention.
Yeah, so election day is November 7th. And there are 369 electoral votes up for grabs in 1876. On election night, there is tons of violence in the former Confederate states. Massive amounts of violence against Black Americans. The amount of violence had grown significantly since the early part of Reconstruction, but this is some of the worst violence of the period, particularly in those states that had not been quote unquote redeemed. South Carolina and Florida, there were horrible reports, and Louisiana had been experiencing it for some time. There's also massive voter fraud. There's one place in South Carolina that reports 101% voter turnout.
That's remarkable turnout. We should all aim for that.
Yeah, and voter fraud is a serious issue actually in the 19th century. People sometimes say that there is voter fraud in the U.S. today. We do not have voter fraud. This was real voter fraud, real serious voter fraud, and you can see how that would happen when we don't have a serious election infrastructure like we do today. They really just turn out all kinds of craziness. So in the evening of the election and the next morning, the Tilden folks really think they have it. They definitely have 184 electoral votes. So they need 185 to win, and they feel pretty confident. They're pretty excited about it. The Hayes people are certain that they have at least 166, which is not real close. But the Tilden people have not won it. What's happened is that there are 20 votes that are sort of up in the air. What's happened is that Louisiana and South Carolina and Florida are not clear. And there is also one vote in Oregon that is under some question. So what happens in those three states in the former Confederacy is that both sides claim to have won. And
that's important, though, because it's not just that the states objectively were trying to decide who had the most votes. It's that you had Republicans and Democrats in the legislature and the governor's office in different places in different states who simply said, well, we've won. And what a mess.
What a mess, yes. And so each of those groups sends their count to Congress to say that we've won the election. So at this moment, Congress is receiving two different counts from each of those states, which is, what do you do with that? You don't know exactly who is the right body to trust. State law is supposed to guide this, but it's kind of hard to tell which is correct in this case.
And there's no Electoral Count Act yet.
There's no Electoral Count Act, right? That doesn't happen until 1887, so we're totally unsure. The situation in Oregon is a little bit different because in Oregon, the problem is with one of the electors who they're worried he did not resign his federal post in time to count as someone who could be a member of the Electoral College. And so the Democrats are claiming there's no way this can be a Republican vote, and so his is in dispute. So this is all chaos. It's total chaos. Initially, President Grant sends some folks to these disputed states to try to get things sorted out. He sent some very famous people to Louisiana. One of them is future President James Garfield, which is sort of amusing. He sends future Supreme Court Justice Stanley Matthews, real famous people to Louisiana to try to get things sorted, but nothing comes of this. We still have disputed votes. We don't really know what to do, and Congress is totally losing it. Yeah. They have no idea what to do with these votes, and there are all kinds of problems with what Congress is going to be able to do to handle this because Congress is divided. So we have a Democratic House and a Republican Senate. And boy, is this going to cause all kinds of problems.
There's so much going on there, building on what we talked about political culture and parties and everything. But one thing we've kind of glossed over is we think about the concept of election security now. For the last couple of elections, it's been huge, with many groups in civil society working on it and focusing on election workers. And there's definitely a federal role in protecting elections from interference and calling out issues. None of that this was not a federal thing. Yes, there were some federal troops there.
There were some federal troops, and there had been a law that allowed Grant to send a certain amount of federal troops to these areas, but it just is not. There's no way to protect. Right. In the same way that we might imagine today. I mean, first of all, think about the level of federal bureaucracy that we have today. There's just nothing close to that in the 19th century. I mean, and in an order of magnitude, like it's just not close. And then think about the ways that you can intimidate voters. So, you have people who are not close to the polls, but standing in the roads, 12 miles from the polls who are making it impossible for people to pass, or who are intimidating voters near their homes, or who are, engaging in all kinds of ways of making things difficult for voters. And that way, these troops can't do much about it. And there are only so many troops. So one other problem is that you have a military that is exhausted and also not feeling super comfortable with the idea of continuing to exist in these territories that are states, that are areas that have been readmitted to the Union. And the U.S. Army is notoriously unhappy about being in these spaces. And many of them have already moved on to fighting Native Americans, dispossessing them of land in the West. So we've got all kinds of problems with these sort of the setup of trying to protect elections, even as there are some mechanisms for Grant to send troops to the South.
I think that's really an important point that we don't want to lose, that we now understand at a fundamental level that election security is national security, that protecting elections is part of a wider conception of national security. And in part, that's due to foreign interference and foreign political warfare against elections. But even back then, this is for the President of the United States. This is about the most important thing the body politic does for the national level. And yet, the idea was, well, does every polling place at every parish in Louisiana have federal troops ensuring the sanctity? No, not even close. And I think we, again, backward project too much about, well, the results came in and they're presumed to be free and fair. And I think it's really the opposite, is in so many places, there is no such guarantee that ballots are even being counted properly, much less reported properly after the counting. Remarkable to me is the fact you said, with all of this suppression and all of these people that literally can't get to the polls because they're being prevented physically from getting there, or they're literally dead because of the violence. And yet it was the highest turnout election in American presidential history. We had 81+% of the eligible voters turning out, which shows you just how intense this period was.
I think it's even worse than this, because one of the things that is really striking about this election, if you spend time looking at elections in the 19th century, is that it's a contested election and it's going to have this insane result, but it was almost entirely expected. From 1868 through 1875 and early 1876, congressmen talked about how this was going to happen.
Yeah.
They talked constantly about it. I mean, there are so many efforts to try to change the system in all kinds of ways. There are efforts to eliminate the Electoral College. There are efforts to change the process of voting in Congress, or of counting the vote in Congress. There is a rule that I'm sure we'll talk about in a moment that they try to get rid of, the 22nd Joint Rule, that is, governs some of what they do in Congress. There are all kinds of efforts to fix the problem. And in 1872, they actually had already dealt with this problem because Louisiana had already sent 2 different sets of returns in 1872. So it wasn't the first time that they had experienced this. And in fact, this is actually part of the 19th century political experience, is dysfunction in elections, and dysfunction in presidential elections in particular. I mean, one thing that I think is important about it is to recognize that people actually cared much more about their local and state elections. And that's even going to be true in this election. In particular, we, I think, assume that people in the former Confederate states were really upset about this election. And of course, they wanted Tilden to win, but they cared much more about their own state elections because they wanted to have rule over their own states. White Southerners were very concerned about their elections for governor, about their elections for local representation, and whether Tilden or Hayes was president wasn't actually going to matter that much to them because federal bureaucracy was not that big, but their local elections were going to matter an enormous amount. Whereas today, who is president actually matters way more than it would have then. So that's actually part of the sort of total picture of what's going on here.
And I'm embarrassed I don't know this fact, and hopefully you wouldn't fail me in one of your classes for this. But if I recall correctly, state legislatures were still picking senators.
Correct.
Right?
Correct.
Okay,
Yes.
Okay, I will pass. I will make it to your next. I will make it to the graduate seminar someday. Okay, so let's talk about the election. You mentioned the returning boards are sending in different things, governors, legislatures, and Congress has to deal with it. And they don't even have the flawed Electoral Count Act yet.
Right.
What they have is the 12th Amendment from 1804-ish, if my memory serves. And it simply says, the votes shall then be counted.
Yes.
As if it's just magical, right? It's something like Mount Olympus. It's just the votes shall be counted. But here they are with different votes, different parties in different chambers of Congress. How did they resolve this? And here, yes, bring in the 22nd Joint Rule and some of those little details of history that are just so fun.
It's totally bonkers. Yeah. So the Senate is controlled by Republicans and the House is controlled by Democrats. Only recently do they get control. Republicans had controlled the House for a long time. And in 1865, Republicans had passed this 22nd Joint Rule, which had said that in elections, if either house objected to a state's returns, they could reject those returns, eliminate them from the count, and continue on. Either house, Senate or House of Representatives. And this was designed in part for the 1864 election because they wanted to make sure that they could proceed without any problems. And this rule had been on the books for a long time, and it didn't really pose that much of a problem as long as the Republicans were in charge. But now that the Democrats had control over the House, this was going to be a really big issue because what the Democrats could do in theory is object to enough of the returns so that there wouldn't be a majority of electoral votes which would send the election to the House of Representatives, and then the House of Representatives would get to pick the president. So Republicans are freaking out about this. They're very upset, and they are arguing repeatedly that this rule is no longer in effect. They're saying, oh, it's been superseded, or it's expired, or whatever else. Instead, many of them are arguing that actually just the president of the Senate gets to count all the votes and nobody else is involved. So these are the arguments they're making. They're getting all kinds of different arguments back and forth. They're proposing all kinds of new ways of counting. At one point, Democrats in the House get together and decide, we're going to impeach Ulysses S. Grant because that might be one way to get through to people, that we need to do it our way. And they're at a total stalemate. Finally, some kind of sense prevails, and each house puts together a committee to discuss what they're going to do about this election. And so in December, the two committees meet, the joint committee gets together, and they start talking about possible solutions to how they're going to deal with this stalemate. And they don't have a lot of great ideas. I mean, it's a really big problem, and there is no precedent for this. And so they argue, and they come up with all of these different plans, many of which nobody likes. And finally, in January 1877, they put together a plan that they're somehow able to get people to agree to. I'll say at the outset that nobody in the Tilden camp, like his main camp, really likes this idea. Hayes also not super excited about this idea. It's a congressional plan, and so they're going to go along with it. But it is not actually something that either candidate is all that excited about.
But there weren't many other good options.
No, there weren't. I mean, truly, I'll say that one thing to be said about this plan, whatever you think of it, is that it tells you something about the way that people are thinking about the Constitution, which is that there is a lot of creativity in the way that they think about constitutionalism in this period. They don't feel necessarily bound by what has been, because they have to think creatively. They do care about the Constitution. They care about those boundaries for what is right, but they also think creatively within those boundaries. And this is something that I think we sometimes overlook when we think about today, because we assume that everybody shares the same constitutional ideas throughout history, but there are so many constitutional problems in the 19th century that people are constantly trying to work out. And this is a moment where there is no guide, there is no clear way to handle it, and so they come up with this plan. So the plan is this: they're going to have 5 members of the House, 5 members of the Senate, and 5 members of the Supreme Court get together and decide what to do about these returns, which returns are the right returns. And what they'll do is the House is controlled by Democrats, so there'll be 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans from the House. The Senate is controlled by Republicans, so there'll be 3 Republicans and 2 Democrats from the Senate. And then they are going to pick Supreme Court justices also based on parties. And this is important. We, again, sometimes think today we should get rid of our ideas of thinking about Supreme Court justices as partisans, but people were very aware of political parties and justices in this period. Everyone talked about the Supreme Court justices from the perspective of their political parties.
Right. Okay. Hearing you talk about each step of this, something occurs to me that maybe I'm overreaching here, but we hear about it being kicked to committees in the House and in the Senate, and we think, oh, they're just, when something gets kicked to a committee, that's just a mess. But it actually was the way of solving it. The House as a whole was not going to decide, so they needed a committee. The Senate as a whole was not going to decide, so they needed a committee. In turn, those committees couldn't themselves decide, so they selected a smaller group of 5 representatives, 3 and 2, 5 senators, 2 and 3, and then the Supreme Court, 2 and 2. So their solution each time is, we can't resolve this as a nation. We failed. We can't resolve this as a Congress of two bodies. We failed. We can't resolve this as a joint committee. We failed. So let's create an even smaller committee. And of course, it doesn't stop there because it's assumed, rightly, that people will vote on party lines. So they stack it so that it's basically 7-7. And so it ultimately ends up being, well, we can't get the country to decide. We can't get the elected representatives to decide. We can't get the committee to decide. We can't get 15 people to decide. We're going to get one person to decide. And that logic is very similar to the Roman Republic picking a dictator to get through a crisis. Now,
Yeah.
different because of the dictatorial powers, right? But as a metaphor, it's a similar way of political thinking, which is we can't resolve some very contentious issues as a group. It's too hard in a short period of time. We're running out of time. We have weeks until inauguration at this point. We need to figure this out. And so we need to find one good man. And yes, everybody involved was a man at the time. One good man who's going to be able to be as objective as possible so that there's enough credibility that we don't go into another civil war at this point. Who do they think is that one man?
Yeah. Well, I'll say I don't know that they necessarily thought that everybody would vote along party lines. I do think there was a possibility that people could be convinced. There were certainly some questions about it. One thing about that is to remember that parties were not necessarily as stuck the way they are today. And so I do think there was an expectation that if you get a small group of people together, maybe you would be able to get some kind of
maybe
push. Yeah. And I don't know that there was an expectation that people would not be objective. I do think that there's a belief that especially this group of people, most of them were the elite of the elite.
Okay.
So when they were picking this final person, what they were trying to do was find someone not who was apolitical or nonpartisan or outside of the political parties, but someone they could find who was balanced between these two groups. So first, we normally think of David Davis, who is a member of the Supreme Court, as the person that they're trying to pick. And he was the person that a lot of people had in mind as the fifth justice that they would choose. David Davis had run for president in 1872. He was a potential liberal Republican pick. And he was someone who had been very close friends with Lincoln. He was one of Lincoln's appointments to the Supreme Court. So he had been in the Republican Party, but he had also flirted with the Democrats. So he seemed like he might be, possible on either side. He certainly was not a reliable Republican vote, although many people thought he would vote with the Republicans because ultimately he seemed on that side. That is the standard story. In my own research, I've discovered that actually quite a few people were interested in the person who was ultimately chosen, which is Joseph Bradley of New Jersey, who was also a Supreme Court justice.
You have to give us a little bit more background on him because the small percentage that even know of David Davis, the same smaller percentage of that group knows of Joseph Bradley.
That's right. So Joseph Bradley was a Supreme Court justice from New Jersey. He was appointed by Grant in 1870. He was mostly appointed by Grant to overturn the legal tender decision. This is a long story that I won't bore you all with, but essentially he wanted to overturn a Supreme Court decision that already existed. And so some folks accused him of packing the court. Here's one of our early packing the court decisions. That is not a modern phenomenon. So Bradley is from New Jersey. But what's really interesting about Joseph Bradley is that he is the first Northern justice to ride circuit. That means he goes and serves as a circuit justice or a circuit judge in the Deep South. Yeah. So Florida and Louisiana are in his circuit. And he had been very involved in some of the most important Supreme Court cases in the period just before this, including the slaughterhouse cases and U.S. v. Cruikshank, which was a case involving a massacre in Louisiana of Black Americans who are trying to exercise their political rights. And he had sided with white Southerners in Louisiana, particularly in Cruikshank. And I think there were many white Southerners who believed that he was a good choice because he had been more reasonable in those decisions. Okay. Now, I think Davis was still the first choice of many people, and particularly people in Washington. But there are quite a few newspapers in the South that are promoting Bradley as the best choice in this case.
That's a good find, because my very shallow research on this to write a section in a chapter in my book about presidents leaving office was Davis was almost like the gravitational pull that everybody thought, well, of course it's got to be this guy. He's flirted with Democrats. Some people have even mentioned him running on a Democratic ticket in the future, but he was Lincoln's manager, for Christ's sake. Like, this guy is ready-made for this, and Bradley seemed like an afterthought. And it's good to know that digging into the research actually reveals a more complex case.
I really think it was more complex for white Southerners. In Washington, I think it was a little more, Davis seemed more of a possibility, but there were many people who thought Davis would go with the Republicans regardless.
Okay, and so what happened?
It becomes a moot point, though, very quickly.
Right.
Yes, because what happens is the committee presents this plan to Congress, and the Senate votes in favor of it on, let me see if I have the dates correct. Okay, the Senate votes in favor of it on January 24th.
Okay.
And then the day after that, David Davis is selected by the Illinois legislature to become the next senator from Illinois.
Which makes it impossible for him to serve.
Well, he resigns and says, well, I guess he's not quite, he's going to serve out the rest of his term in the Supreme Court, or the rest of the what was then the term of the court, which ended in March. He's going to decide to stay through that, but he thinks it's not appropriate anymore for him to be on the commission. If he ever thought it was appropriate, he may have declined.
It's a way out.
But members of the House don't get word of this in time. So on January 26th, they vote to approve the commission's plan, and so it's going to go forward. And so Davis is not going to do it, and as a result, they have to select somebody else. And so what happens in this plan is that the other 4 Supreme Court justices get to pick the 5th person, and they go into a conversation about it, and it takes most of the day, and they decide to pick Bradley.
I'm picturing like a conclave, and the smoke comes out of the chimney, right? This decision. But it ends up being our old friend, Joseph Bradley.
Joseph Bradley, And Joseph Bradley was a railroad lawyer. He had been a very loyal Republican. He had been a delegate to the 1868 convention, so he had supported Grant. So, you could see why people in Washington would have been skeptical of him as anything other than a Republican guy. And then, we know how the election turns out. We know Hayes becomes president. So in retrospect, people think, oh, of course, he was going to be supporting Hayes. But I think, at the time, there was some consideration that he might vote Tilden's way.
We know this is like a comedian doing a performance where you tell the punchline first. We know what happened. We know Rutherford B. Hayes ends up winning, and it must be because of this commission. They must vote 8-7. But what do we know about how they decided that? How did they decide on an 8-7 vote to accept all of the disputed votes or disputed returns in Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida for Hayes and not for Tilden?
Yeah, so what's important about this is that there's a big question about whether the commission is going to allow people to investigate behind the returns, to go behind the returns.
To investigate what happened, right?
right? And what that means is, are they going to investigate the circumstances behind the election? And what a lot of Republicans say at the time, and they're not wrong about this, right, is that trying to investigate all of these individual election circumstances would take months and months and would have put off the inauguration of a president and created tons and tons more, uncertainty and constitutional crisis. That doesn't necessarily mean it was the correct decision, but it does create all kinds of problems. It
is a plausible practical argument not to go behind the returns is the clock is ticking. We're now counting. We can count the days until, by the Constitution, this president is done. We really, really want to have the next presidential term start when we can.
Yeah. And they start their deliberations on January 31st. The president is going to be inaugurated in early March. They have very little time to do this. And so they're really concerned about this. After all of this is over, Joseph Bradley is going to write a little thing about why he makes the decision he does. And he says, I decided not to go behind the returns because I think that's interfering with the states. So he makes a states' rights argument for why he doesn't want to go behind the returns. Whether that's true or not, I'm not entirely sure, but he certainly makes the case that that's part of the reason why he doesn't want to go behind the returns. But ultimately, he votes not to go behind the returns and votes in favor of this going Hayes's way. All the votes are 8-7 in favor of the Republicans. One of the really interesting things about this commission, though, is that it's full of people who are constantly arguing in front of the Supreme Court or have some connection with the Supreme Court. So these are all people who are well known to each other. They spend lots of time together. They include very famous lawyers, people who know each other from political campaigns. So Stephen Field, who is a Supreme Court justice from California, is on the commission. He's a Democrat, even though Lincoln has appointed him. His brother is one of the people who argues, David Dudley Field from New York. Charles O'Connor, who's a famous lawyer from New York, also argues. John Archibald Campbell, who had been on the Supreme Court before the Civil War and seceded with his state, comes back to make arguments in front of the Supreme Court. So there are all kinds of people who are well known, and it's almost like a little debating society that gets to make these claims in front of the commission. So it's very private, as you suggest, private and also very elite. I want to say one other thing about your point about the committees, because I also think this is important. Today, we're very aware of how public Congress is when they give speeches. And this was really true in the 19th century, too. And most congressmen tended to speak to the public when they were giving speeches. This was like a constant problem in a way. People complained about it. They called this bunkum speech making, where people get up and deliver these grand speeches to no one, or grand speeches to a busy or sleepy house, or drunk house, as the case may be. And so committee work was really where a lot of things got done, or in, boarding houses or wherever else. So committees were necessary in order to basically achieve anything. And that's why these kinds of things happen, because you can only accomplish things in those circumstances.
One of the big what ifs in American history, and I know many historians don't like the counterfactuals and what ifs, but this was a tinderbox situation in many ways. You had many, although probably not most, but many supporters of Tilden, literally shouting Tilden or blood. There were members of state and county committees, Democrats, who were enrolling Minutemen, like creating militias in case violence broke out. There were actually messages being sent, threatening letters to Hayes with sketches of daggers and knives and revolvers. And it's really interesting to think about, if Tilden had a slightly different personality, and instead of spending the month of December and early January writing an esoteric legal history of electoral balloting and counting methods, which nobody read or cared about, instead of doing that, if he would have said, this is worth fighting for, it could have been a very, talk about election security and national security. This could have been, if not another civil war, it could have been a very, very violent march once they decided this. And there could have been foreign interference taking advantage of America ripping itself apart again. But that didn't happen. Tilden, by personality or by intellect, decided, nope, it's more important to have a result than to have what I think is the legitimate result. Talk through that. How do you look at that issue as a historian and the contingency of Tilden himself versus other factors that played into the ultimately non-violent inauguration of Hayes?
Yeah, Tilden was very angry. He was extremely angry and insisted that he had won the election forever. But a lot of congressmen, and particularly as I mentioned, Southern congressmen, had no interest in disputing this election. There were some Northerners who were perhaps flirting with the possibility of violence, but they also were, they were very proper people, so they didn't want to really engage in this, and many of them had just fought this Civil War, so I think they were less interested in stoking those fires in particular. His ability to say, please don't do this, this is not the way to fight it, is really important. It is really important in American history, because absolutely there could have been additional Civil War. That was a fear that people had well into the 1880s and 1890s, that there could be continued violence. We take for granted, I think, that we have stayed together as a nation for as long as we have. Certainly people in the 19th century did not take that for granted. They thought about it all the time. So it was centrally important, but I do think some of that, again, has to do with the way that politics operated then, which is that it was so decentralized and people cared so much more about other things. Right. Tilden was so bitter. He had so many people fighting for him in other ways. Most Democrats did not show up to the inauguration, including the Supreme Court justices. They didn't show up. And sort of made fun of it. There was an investigation put on by Clarkson Not Potter, who was a Democrat in the House. The following year, he tried to sort of prove that the election was rigged. There were some other folks who were trying to bring this to the Supreme Court later on. Montgomery Blair famously argued the Dred Scott case in favor of Dred Scott in 1857, who was really opposed to the victory of Hayes and tried to bring a case to the Supreme Court in the late 1870s. There are all kinds of people who try to contest it later, but of course unsuccessfully. So people don't really give up. They just don't engage in the kind of violence that we imagine. Right. At the same time, this is a very violent nation. And so there are all kinds of displays of violence and displays of threat. So Bradley, having done all of these votes in favor of Hayes, gets all kinds of threats. People hang him in effigy. They hang all the Republican justices in effigy, but particularly Bradley. He gets death threats all the time. He becomes very bitter himself. So there is a lot of display of anger in certain places. One thing that doesn't happen, though, is sort of the standard story of this is that there is some kind of compromise to prevent violence. This is a story that's in every textbook. It's called The Compromise of 1877. Erase it from your memory. It doesn't exist. It wasn't a thing. I don't know how to get it out of textbooks, but I will spend the rest of my life trying. There was no compromise of 1877. Nobody made any compromise to get rid of violence.
Yeah. The two things that are most interesting to me, in addition to making sure that history is told correctly, which is, of course, the major point. Number one, that Tilden privately was, angry, bitter, probably had thoughts about pushing back, but publicly, he actually said some interesting things. So the quote that I found is he told a dinner crowd in 1877 after Hayes had been inaugurated and he'd had, a couple of months to cool down. He said, "The Republic will live. The institutions of our fathers are not to expire in shame. The sovereignty of the people shall be rescued from this peril and reestablished." Now, that's not saying I accept the results and I've thought about it. And no, not really. He's saying, you know what? We still have our institutions and we're going to get them back. And presumably through the next, election cycle. And it didn't happen, of course, in 1880, but not long after, suddenly you do see the institutions turn a bit. So there's that perspective. And other people involved, including a representative, wrote an article later about how, we really had the big point here. It showed that the people were attached to the law rather than revolution. Well, okay, you're Republican and it went your way, so it's easy to say that. But the flip side is Hayes himself. Is you could imagine a scenario in which Hayes actually seeks some kind of retribution. He actually goes after his political opponents in a harsh way and governs as a radical partisan. Not his character, most certainly, but it could have happened. And he doesn't. And that's an interesting point for me, too, is he was the president. He had the mandate of the election. Close election, yes. But he won and people weren't fighting back. He could have chosen that moment to say, and they tried to cheat. And he chose not to, which makes it, I guess, a good story. That at least not a worse story.
I think that's right. I also think it's a moment of good clarity for thinking again about the way that the political system works in that period. Mm-hmm. After the 1876 election, there are constant predictions that both the Republican and Democratic Party are going to dissolve. They've both shown to be a failure. Yeah. And that there will be new parties that will grow up because they've been such a disaster, and that this election proved that they're a disaster. And they have good reason to think this. This is not a crazy proposition, because in great moments of American political peril, there had been new parties that had grown up. And this is something that, people had been predicting for some time. And so Hayes is in good company in thinking that maybe the political spectrum will shift. And he certainly has different ideas from Grant. Some he continues, including, by the way, he is more supportive of Black rights than some people give him credit. Right. So, I think that's a really important piece, is that there is no insistence that the Republican Party must be the party that saves the Republic. It doesn't have to be that way. It's much harder in our current political system to think about it this way because, we are so institutionalized to imagine Republicans and Democrats, and it would be hard to break that up. But in that period, it would have been possible if a new party had arisen that took hold, or that you could, combine partisans from these two parties that really would have taken us in a different direction. It just didn't happen.
Yeah. There's another factor here, and you've mentioned it, but it's the long shadow of the Civil War itself. Yeah. And especially when we talk about lessons from 1877 to today, you included some chilling words in the Washington Post article that you co-authored just over 4 years ago, talking about why Americans should be reflecting on 1876-77. And you wrote, "Unlike Americans in 1876, we do not have the recent memory of 750,000 Civil War dead, serving as a warning for what happens when one side refuses to accept the outcome of a presidential election." Right. Chilling when you think about it. That was still in the living memory of basically all of the elected representatives and judges at this point. Some of the youthful people, maybe not, but they were living with the effects of it through being orphans or seeing it around them in terms of just the maimed, all of the destruction. We don't have that now. So we've been talking about political institutions and society and culture, but we are not leaving this conversation and walking out to our relatives who are, physically, emotionally damaged or missing because of this great conflict. That's That's a huge difference.
It absolutely is. It absolutely is. I think our inability sort of to feel that sort of precarious nature of the experiment itself is really hard to sort of get.
Yeah.
We don't have that closeness to
Mm-hmm.
it that these folks did. And I think that's part of the reason that they worked so hard to try to find a solution. I mean,
Yeah.
they saw how important it was. They
Right.
saw how important it was to the nation. Of course,
Mm-hmm.
we're a society that's much bigger now. It's much harder to
Mm-hmm.
have people make decisions. There is some easiness about a group of 15 men who all know each other, spend a bunch of time together, pretty much all the same social class, getting together and making a bunch of decisions. And we're in a much different society now.
Yeah.
Uh, it's
Yeah.
harder to make those kinds of changes.
Sure.
Um, Probably for the good in that
Yeah.
way, but it is a different kind of circumstance as a
Mm-hmm.
result.
The dog that didn't bark here for me, thinking about this as election security and national security, is the lack that I've seen of any substantial foreign interference or attempts to manipulate this, because the period from, I mean, really starting in November, but especially January, February, and the first half of March, while it was an inauguration, but people were still holding their breath seeing what would happen. That means you've got about 6 to 8 weeks where, even with the limited communication of the time, you easily could have had somebody in a different era in American history have another foreign power try to manipulate this.
Yeah.
I, in my casual research, did not see any strong evidence of that. Did you uncover that the people involved were even thinking about it as a national vulnerability?
No, I've not seen anything like that. I mean, people are always thinking about comparisons to other countries,
Hmm.
and certainly other countries are thinking about what is happening in the United States. But
Hmm.
I have never seen anything like that of that kind in the 19th century. There were a lot of claims, particularly in the 1850s, that Catholics were trying to control the election. Totally
Sure.
spurious
Yeah, yeah,
claims.
yeah.
But this is not a moment in which that is really going on.
Hmm.
So yeah, we are living in a different era because of that.
Yeah. So I can, trying to put a wrap on this, I can tie a bow in two very different ways.
Yeah.
One of them is, oh gosh, we have tough times now. We had tough times then, and it's never going to get better because this is politics. This is part of the problem of governing societies. You're going to have these recurrent flares that come up, and sometimes they're really, really close to being really, really bad, and sometimes they are. So it's almost a negative thing, which is, this just proves that even in a time when some Americans who don't focus on history as much think, well, the 1870s were kind of boring, right? I know about the Civil War and I know about the First World War, and in between everything was fine. So it's a dark picture. On the other side of it, I tie a bow that looks really shiny and happy, which is, when it comes down to it, we're creative, we're inventive, and even though it was not unconstitutional, it certainly wasn't anticipated that this is how something would be resolved. But damn it, we found a way collectively. We found a way to get through this and not only survive but thrive as a nation in a century, in the century since. I don't know. Minute to minute, I can go back and forth between the darker and the lighter interpretation. Both probably have some truth, but reflecting on it as you have, where do you come down? Is this a story people should look back on and take some faith in, or a story people should look back on and say, oh no, this is a warning?
Yeah, I sort of think about the 19th century generally less in sort of positive and negative terms, although, there are always negatives and positives in almost everything, right? I mean, the Civil War itself is a horrible, horrible moment of death and destruction and disunity, but also, 4 million enslaved people are free. So I think there's always pluses and minuses to every situation if you want to evaluate it that way.
Yeah.
But I think in terms of what we can learn from it, there are ways to think about the 1876 election as part of a pattern of constitutional creativity, constitutional thinking, and also of political elasticity. And those are the things that I take from it. Ways of thinking about our political system that we don't always trust in today. And one thing I particularly like to think about when I think about this period is just how engaged the average person was with politics, how much they cared about their local political circumstances, their state political circumstances, their judicial circumstances, the law for them, not just giving it up to other people. And if those people cared that much about that, I think we can too. And I hope that's something that we can do going forward.
Before I forget, tell everybody about your current project and the book that you, certainly I, hope is coming soon, capturing a lot of the research you've been doing.
Yeah, the book is coming in 2026. It's called The Political Supreme Court. It'll come out with University of North Carolina Press. And it is about the political activities and political culture of Supreme Court justices in the 19th century, the kinds of things that they did in American politics while they were on the Supreme Court, and why in an era in which justices had very little judicial authority, very little constitutional authority, they played such an important role in American politics.
Yeah, a story that's, I think, largely unknown, even to people who have studied the period, because we all gravitate towards the presidents, the wars, the elections, and we don't look at that angle of it quite enough. So I'm glad you're working on it.
Thank you.
Now is the time when I will pull out our chatterbox and ask you a random question. Rachel. Oh, I have a feeling you have many answers for this. Let's go for another hour and a half. Okay. Or you can just pick one. Name one dead political or national security related leader from any era that we could really use right now.
I have a million, but I think I have to go with W.E.B. Du Bois, who I think is one of the most inspiring writers of the 19th and 20th century. And if you haven't read Black Reconstruction in America, I think that's the first book anyone should pick up, particularly the last little section of that book, which I always teach in my undergraduate course on the Civil War era. He's a beautiful writer, but he also just really understood the major problems in American society, and he had a way with words.
Because of that, is he one of the people that not only, for answering this question, do you think America could use right now, but would he be one of those 3 or 4 people in that hypothetical question about who you want at the dinner table?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, because he's a good talker.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, you are one of the 4 or 5 people I want at my dinner table for that conversation, and I will also invite W.E.B. Du Bois to join us. Thank you for joining me for this conversation. I've learned a lot, even as we've looked at this and talked about this before. I always grow from the experience, and hopefully people take away that looking back at these cases, looking at different ways of conceptualizing elections, election security, national security, there's something to be gained in the way we think about these things and the creativity and flexibility that we need to get through crises. Rachel, thank you.
Thank you.
That was Chatter, a production of Lawfare and Goat Rodeo. Please subscribe to the podcast and find us on Twitter at ThatWasChatter.